I have work in the festival in collaboration with Tomo Kihara, who's here, the sign projects. But Irini asked me to speak a little bit about some of my other work as well, because I've been working on the theme of oceans for many years. And the title of my PhD was Writing Coastlines. So I'm going to talk a lot of, just show you some of the projects that I've done. I work a lot with language, so this may be difficult for the translators. I apologize. um, but everything is on my website here. So I'm giving you more of an introduction to work that you could look at later if you wanted. I wanted to say also that I work mostly online and then make book projects. So An Ocean of Static is uh, a book from a few years ago, and we can see. I'm not going to talk about the book very much, but we see this interface. The title, An Ocean of Static, came from a digital work that I made called Etheric Ocean, and the background is very dark and designed to be almost impossible to view on projectors. So you're welcome. But on the website, it's a very dark blue. And so I wanted to show you this because a lot of, as we've seen, there's a lot of science behind oceans. And I'm not a scientist. I'm a poet. So one of my endeavors in life is to try to find ways to talk about very scientific things in a poetic way. And so, for example, I often try to find ways to talk about things that um, are quite unknowable. So, most of us have never been deep underwater. Has anybody here been under the ocean? Any divers? Right? So, how do we think about a thing that we have no experience of in our body? Some of us are divers here in this community. I know there's diving, but like I'm talking about the middle of the ocean. How do we understand the magnitude, the scale of the ocean in relation to our body? So, one of my methodological approaches to trying to think about something I don't understand is to take another thing I don't understand and smash these things together. So, this title, Etheric Ocean, ether doesn't exist. So, it's very useful. It was invented by British scientists as a concept to make sense of the transmutation of electromagnetic signals through space. So when wireless was invented, scientists couldn't understand how wireless signals could move through space. So they invented this concept of the ether. So in my work, I'm often trying to think about two things at once. I'm trying to think about the ocean itself, but I'm also trying to think about this ocean of air that's above the ocean. We can't just think about the ocean without thinking about wind and air and all of these systems around. Um, my work often attempts to make the internet scroll in a horizontal way, which is not entirely obvious. And this work takes a lot of archival materials. So I worked with the Marconi archive at the Bodleian Library at Oxford University in England. And I worked with a lot of sound, but also a lot of this text, for example, is a generative text. It will keep changing, but it's using the ship's logs from the HMS Challenger, which is a British scientific vessel that sailed in the 1800s. They were taking sounding the ocean, because in order to lay telegraphic cables, they had to know how deep the ocean was. And there's a lot of reading on that, people used to think that the ocean was bottomless. So a ship had to go and drop a lead weight, every few hundred meters to understand the depths of the ocean. Um, and there's audio files in this work about underwater sounds. And I won't talk that much more about this piece, but just to say, again, with sound, I think most of us who live here in the air can't understand how noisy a place the ocean is. And I've tried to do some thinking about underwater sound. I'll leave that there for now. I wanted to mention briefly also, uh, I wanted to mention briefly also this text, archival materials. So these couplets, to use a poetic term, these couplets on top come from a British uh, not a scientific text, a colonial text. The British basically figured that they could conquer the world by taking lots of notes. So that's how science really works. You know, these expeditions go out and they take lots of notes. And sometimes they take specimens and samples, and sometimes they take hostages. So I wanted to use the text from these scientific. Oh, this is very difficult. I wanted to use the text from some of these scientific journeys that most of us who aren't in science don't really know about, and incorporate them into a poetic framework. So I'm just moving along very quickly. But to use this one example, these lines: the currents of sea are favorable, the tops of the few stunted acacias. These are all this sentence will keep refreshing itself, and these are all sentences from Charles Darwin's Voyages of the Beagle. And I searched through the whole book and took all of his references to wind. So this line will keep repeating all of the references to wind from Darwin's Voyages of the Beagle, and it's an example of the way that I tend to work. And then in the book, I use that text in another way. Um, Moving on very quickly. So, The Pleasure of the Côte, Le Plaisir de la Côte, is this piece was commissioned by the Archives Nationales, the French National Archives. I lived in Montreal for many years, and I speak French, but not perfectly, and I don't um, write in French. So I made this bilingual work by using found material. Basically, I worked with the archive of a French hydrographer, Charles-François Beauton-Beaupré, which is a long name. And he sailed on a voyage to the South Pacific in the 1791 to 1793 around the south coast of Australia. And up along New Zealand and into the Solomon Islands, so into these islands. And a lot of my work tries to address the colonialism of these scientific voyages. So some of us might think of colonialism in the sense of settler colonialism, but also these scientific voyages where they're, objectively measuring and doing all of these things. There's also a colonial implication for example, in this voyage, they're renaming. He's creating sea charts, and he's writing new names on these coastlines. And these coastlines, of course, have been inhabited by tens of thousands of years by indigenous people, and gone. So I used the scientific drawings from his sketches for charts, not the charts themselves, because I was interested in his process, his scientific process, which is very similar to an artistic process. And so he used a system of letters to identify all of these islands. So I spent days in the French National Archives going through all these maps, documenting these tiny, tiny, tiny islands, and then I created a font. So this is a font of island letters that I then use to write throughout the rest of the piece. It's poetry. It's definitely not science, but there's a whole a Pacific scholar from Hawaii who talks about how the colonial, like the French and British, come into the South Pacific and remap so that island nations that see themselves as a sea of islands become islands in a sea. And so this is my attempt to disorganize the colonial organizational order and create a new language with which to think about these things in a very unscientific way. Um, and but also to work with archives that the Archives Nationales invited me and to work with these materials that no one's looking at. These old science. This image here in the background is a sketch that was drawn in 1792, and nobody's looked at it since. And so I'm using this as a structure to write poetry. Um, and I won't talk in great detail about the text. It's a bit complicated, but I'm using the scientific text from Charles-François Beautemps-Beaupré and the philosophy of Roland Barthes, Le plaisir du texte, the pleasure of the text. But I replaced the word text with coast, the pleasure of the coast. So then the hydrographer becomes also a philosopher, and also we explore some of the desire, the desire in this mapping. And I also used fragments from French literature, a novel by Jean Giraudoux called Suzanne et le Pacifique. And a young French woman becomes she wins a ship. Now my brain is stuck between English and French. She wins a voyage around the world, and she becomes shipwrecked on an island in the South Pacific in the region that's charted by Charles-François Beautemps-Beaupré. So I'm, mostly using these ocean archives and the ocean texts as raw material, collage, to make us rethink some of the fixed scientific ideas that we have, but also the assumptions that we have. I'm going to end very briefly with this very new work that hasn't officially been published yet, but why should that stop us? A lot of the way that I work involves performance. So this is a browser-based work that I made the browser-based work, but I also work in collaboration a lot. So I'm working with a musician, Jules Rawlinson, who is based at University of Edinburgh. And so I made this browser-based piece, which I think of as a score for live performance. And it's very difficult with an unfamiliar keyboard, but it goes back and forth and up and down. But I can only do one at a time here. So this piece uses all of the images are from the British Library. For all the artists in the room, I'll tell you that the British Library put over 1 million images in a Flickr Commons, and they're free for anyone to use. Tomo writes this down. And so um, but the images are all from books from the 17th, 18th century, the height of British imperialism. So many of the images have an underlying colonial idea that if you just look quickly, maybe you don't think. But this diagram, for example, of the ship to me is, so it's from a geometry textbook. So from point A, you can see the top of the mast coming over the horizon. And from point B, you can see the mainsails coming over the horizon. And from point C, you can see the deck. Okay, so this is basic geometry. But if you're an indigenous person standing on the shore and this Western sailing ship is coming over the horizon, then this has a very different framework. So a lot of what I'm trying to do in this kind of work is to take these images that we just we don't consider very much, these very boring, tiny, small diagram in a geometry textbook, and make it big, put it on the page. And also, though, we developed this as a performance piece, where Jules does live vocalization based on my voice. So I created a libretto. It's like a sound art opera that I can't really fully demonstrate for you here, but in the web version, he's now created an audio track that responds to the mouse location. So, and we've also written an academic article in the structure of the libretto of the piece. So, moving through these vast archives of ocean science and bringing them into these very different kind of contexts of browser-based web art, sound art, live performance, and then also into the poetry world. Um, you know, I'm going to leave it at that. I don't want to go over time, but just to invite you to look at any of these projects on my website. And thank you for the opportunity to share this work with you. Thank you.